This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And today is Sunday, January the 7th, 2018. Make sure you start writing your checks there, if you even still write checks anymore. Some of us have kind of gone paperless that way. And this is the Prairie Monk Show, where this is the weekly look at rails, trails, white greenways this time of year, but they're greenways under there anyway. And everything else that is coming up, including conservation type stuff I see on the menu today.
So, temperature outside is balmy. It's 24 degrees. So if you need to go somewhere today, you have the okay to do it. I wanted to say something about polyethylene tetraphthalate. It's a type of plastic that can be recycled and reused. And I picked up a organic set of eggs that was in a very neat package that was plastic. It was a good design, and it was it had a fold over so that the eggs were protected. And there were all sorts of signs to say that this was organic. But there was a disconnect there. We're trying to reduce plastic use, and this is where there is an established alternative. It's usually paper mache. And I tend not to buy any product where it could be replaced by a renewable type material. Something like paper mache is coming from a tree that can be regrown, and the plastic is coming usually from an oil-based situation that is not renewable. So I wrote a letter to the company, and I wanted to point out that this was a very good teaching aid for teaching people the usefulness of plastic, but it's a negative teaching aid in that respect. It's teaching a use where there is an alternate. It's just that organic and plastic do not sit well together if there's an alternative. Okay. I may receive some note about that. I want to say that this last week or so, we've been looking at a site at Monticello that's very interesting. Tom Scott, who is a railroad engineer and very involved with family at the Monticello Railroad Museum, and he drives trains for the museum and does a lot of work, yard work, and puts in replacement ties and things like that. He was also president of a group called the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad, which we hope will restore rail to 4 miles of land between White Heath and Seymour that's owned by Heartland Pathways, and continue on railed territory which is an abandonment process between Seymour, Bonneville, and Champaign. So Tom was at a Monticello Railroad Museum meeting, and there was a discussion of a small strip of land, 21 acres, on a hill that is a part of the Cerro Moraine. It's runs parallel to the I-72 and is sandwiched between the Railroad Museum historic train line that also runs up the hill to White Heath. The site is on a slope, so it qualifies for CRP, a preservation of the land that is sloping, that is erodible. So it also takes some land out of action for a while, and so it's an agricultural mechanism to keep agricultural land afloat. The museum has bought that land, and it has on it CRP plantings of trees and some prairie. It was briefly discussed that, and Tom suggested this, that the Scouts might be interested in caring for and developing the site as a natural area. It's a sort of site that could be visited by the public, either by train from the Railroad Museum or by trail, by foot, on a nature trail, or by car from a nearby road. There is adjunct space just up the road a little bit on this railroad bed. Nearby is an open area where before the Railroad Museum had access to buying ICG mainline, which it now uses. It used to use about 1.5 miles of Illinois Traction Company rail up to the top of the moraine, where there is or was a switch so that an engine could be in front of the train on a tour. The area is a little open between the old ICT line and the main line, and it's very healthy in terms of prairie remnants. So this is a spot that's up the road just a little bit and could be related. So Tom suggested and received some favorable comment that Scouts could use this, could protect it, and could learn from it for Eagle Scouts or scouting generally. Possibly could include Girl Scouts, although I think they are separate entities. And there are trees, that some of which have died. there's the agricultural history of a small plot of land with that cannot be cultivated across the hill. The cultivation would be up and down the hill, which is not very conducive to erosion prevention. The passage of farm machinery would mean that there's erosion there, and that's part of the reason why there's CRP there. So there's some agricultural history, there's some forest, and it's not just crud trees that have been growing automatically. These are planted trees. So there's some forestry, and there's some prairie. The prairie is probably on the simplistic side, but it could be augmented, and the area is accessible. It's urban in the sense that there's heavy traffic on 72 right outside. The question arises as to whether the noise would reduce the value of the site as a wildlife habitat. But as the CRP trees and prairie grow, it will absorb that sound and almost to the point that you will not encounter it. This site probably has a range of soil types, so it could be a soil science experience. And going back to the urban situation, we have to realize that we have so few opportunities to gather up natural areas that this is a good demonstration that you can work with a natural area near to communities and transportation. It's convenient. It's within a few miles of Monticello and available to citizens who would like to volunteer. That's fairly important because when you have natural areas out in the boondocks, there's a transportation situation. You have to either have carpooling or a small bus to take people to that location. So it's convenient. And I would like to say that this is a small piece of natural area which, when you combine a number of natural areas, you get some sort of connectivity for creatures, especially birds, to fly from one site to another. So I would like to say something about the area around this. Nearby is a rather wonderful lodge park, which has wildlife on the banks of the Sangamon River and a range of habitats. And then across the river, there's Buck's Pond. Up the road a little is Shady Rest, 30 acres on the banks of the river. There's Allerton Park with a lot of range of habitat, and other areas like the Hannon Levee, which has just been installed, and there are places like Friends Creek. It's a little further away, but it relates. These are not 10,000 acres of prairie where you would have a range of of habitats and the possibility of something like 100 species. This is little plots that is all that we have left. If you want to go to bigger and better prairies, you can go to a new Kankakee Basin, which is putting in a large area of prairie. You can go to Manhattan, Kansas, and have a really large natural area on flint hills that weren't easy to cultivate. So this is a national level prairie. You would just all we have locally is railroad remnants that are a narrow strip that's not very representative of a large acreage of prairie, and we have little strips like the one that I'm talking about. But they all add up. That's what we have, and if you want your population to be aware of the heritage ecosystem, then these sites are tremendously helpful, even if they're the only ones that we have. You also have places like Shawnee Forest, which deal with the forest aspects of this site. And there are enough of these sites that if you're dealing with scouts, you often have leaders who also need to know about their ecology, often family members who may not necessarily be familiar with prairie or forest. And so there are places that you can go to take scouts so they can see a different array of heritage. You could go to Wildlife Prairie Park in Peoria, for instance. That's just probably 70 miles away. And so there are teaching sites nearby. There are also interested groups. There are institutions like the University of Illinois, which has a Prairie State Natural History Survey with a forestry department and agriculture and planning and these people can advise and be helpful, often with enthusiasm. There are students in places like the more applied Parkland College, as well as teachers. And so there's a volume of people who care and are interested. There are human resources people who could be part of an application for grants. The site is owned by the Railroad Museum, which would have 501c3 status, and the other agency that's interested, to which Tom Scott is president, is the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. So you have two sites that have 501c3 and non-profit standing. You have a bunch of conservation agencies that are like the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, Isaac Walton League, that could also be interested and helpful. And you have a natural master naturalist program at the university that would relate. So I'm rather pleased with that initial attempt, to have the mainly Boy Scouts interested in that site. Girl Scouts may be interested too. I don't know their organization quite so well. And they're two different organizations. The Boy Scouts tend to be a little bit more formal, and the Girl Scouts are a little open and freer in that sense. From an overall situation, I would say this little plot of land adds to a range of natural and cultural resources in the area. You have Allerton Park as a key, and you have a railroad museum. You have the history of the Pepsin factory and $1 million mile of State Street in Monticello, where wealth came from the discovery that Pepsin could be a useful counterpart to diarrhea and constipation. It's a product that went around the world, and so it's part of the local history. You have the bottomlands that could have been flooded by a Oakley reservoir, and there's been a lot of action to prevent that. Bruce Hannon being key in there, Jack Paxton, Clark Bullard, and a bunch of people who have worked to have Justice Douglas from the Supreme Court actually come and speak on behalf of this site. And so Allerton was not flooded. So there's a history of Sam Allerton coming and buying territory after being a supplier of food for the Union Army in the Civil War. Armies run on their food, and so there's that sort of history. So I look at this general area as a national resource. The museum has acquired other land, and it means that it will not be hemmed in by development, and I'm just pleased to see all these things happening and coming together. And I would like to encourage people who may be listening to think about this site, this small site of 21 acres, as a part of a larger retinue of resources that have national level connotations. That means that you may be able to do things like get advice from a state and federal level, apply for support, and then there are also a rather wonderful group of people who would support this objective. So I would like you to think about this and encourage that experience. In there with the national look at things is is the possibility of archaeology. You have in Allerton Park mounds, and these are mounds that relate to Cahokia, where there was at one stage, perhaps 1,000 years before Christ, which is alternatively referred to as before common, just to give it a starting point. We don't exactly know when Christ was born, but you need some date from which to announce your changes, and so that happened early on, and we have a starting point from which we can relate. So this era was at least 1,000 years before common, and it was a rather large population of people at one stage. It centered around St. Louis, but it is related to early settlement of the Americas that came across the Bering Straits and came down to Mesoamerica, and some of the findings of recent periods have been dating this as very early movement of early settlers of the continent, even before some of the historic sites in Egypt and places like that. The mound builders had a philosophy. We don't exactly know what it is. I should say that I enjoyed reading an article in December 2011, Science, and it has an article there that relates this sort of interest, and it extends with mounds from Mexico to Mesoamerica, through to Cahokia, but then extends as far north as Wisconsin. And there are little mounds here, there, and everywhere, and most of them have been disconvolvulated. There was a huge one in St. Louis, and that was taken down. So we've lost a lot of our archaeological history. It is often bolstered by transportation. There are roads through this, what used to be an urban city. Perhaps you're talking about overall perhaps 70,000 people, but in this location also a lot of people. But the taking of a road through to a new bridge means that archaeologists are given calamity money to dig, and they have dug in an interesting manner. For a while, the carbon daters dated this area carefully, and it went back sometimes almost 3,000 years before BC. And that sort of information was somewhat ignored because it was felt that Cahokia was much more recent than that. But some of the archaeologists who've been committed to this site have been digging in mounds in a careful fashion. And so there is a difference between people going out on a Sunday and putting some gelignite in a mound and seeing interesting things happen, to archaeologists putting a rough, tough dig through the mounds, to doing a really bang-up job of archaeology. The problem is that the roads are going to run right over some of this stuff, and so there's a move to get that information quickly. Some of the areas have been farmed, so the soil on top of the archaeological information has been disturbed. So one of the techniques when you don't have much time is to run through and remove 10 inches of soil so that you can find the base of houses. There would be a big mound. There would be a plaza around the mound. We don't know all the social customs. These people were thinkers. They oriented their buildings to the sun and moon and solstice days, and they had feelers out across the country. So recent digs are coming up with shark's teeth that must have come from places like Georgia, and there are stones that come from places to the west. The Ozarks were providing materials. There's material that comes from Wisconsin that has been shaped into plaques and representative creatures. So these cities were population that had moved around. They had bottomlands near to the rivers that could have flooded. There are forestry people who have gone back to the era of counting the growth rings on trees that are way back, and those rings suggest that there were rough times. Some of them were flood times and some of them were drought times. They do not know why these centers eventually dispersed. So there's lots of speculation as to whether this was a political, metaphysical debate about what you do, or whether it was that they ate up their own environment. If you are hunters and gatherers and the deer population drops, that's a problem. If you have a limited area to grow vegetables, that might be a problem. They certainly had ceremonies where there might have been the remains of hundreds and hundreds of animals. So it was a society that was utilizing their resources. So did that mean that they eventually ran out of resources? When you go back to Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific, that's the same sort of debate. Did the people who were there and sophisticated use up their environment? So I wanted to suggest that is a small part of that is located in Allerton Park, and it's a place where we look on these resources that we have as a complex that is near to institutions, near to people who care, near to agriculture, that gives potential tourists an opportunity to think about their environment. And tourists often are going to places because they want to know about those places. Some of the economics that comes to Monticello in the future will be for tourism. So I was very disappointed to know that the Pepsin factory would be taken down, because I felt that factory represented an economic process of early settlement where Dr. Caldwell discovered that you could get pepsin out of seneca leaves. You could add a little alcohol and a little sugar, and it did wonders for your digestive system, to the point that he did not necessarily want to be an entrepreneur, but there were entrepreneurs that took over that process and took it out of his basement in a storefront on the corner of Monticello Square, and there was a Pyatt family house on a nearby hill that could develop this material, which follows through to today. We call it Pepto-Bismol, but it did the same sort of thing. But the factory, which I regarded as a historic monument, is gone. It was in somewhat decaying state, but it was still a substantial building. And eventually this process developed. The entrepreneurs had children, and the children started to be moving off in their own direction, so the factory was taken over by multinationals. But at one stage it employed 300 people, and they had a spur line in there from the railroads. So the factory was located in the very place that would tell you about this economic history. We have to think about those things. Sometimes things like mounds and old factories, they're called gray fields when people move out and take their business to labor situations in other countries that are cheaper than the factories left, and it's very difficult to try and utilize these factories. You can't really put commercial shops in there. It is sort of a historic monument. So how you debate these sorts of things is rather important. So at the moment we're debating a 21-acre plot of land. At other times we're debating a river levee, which has recently been put into preservation. At other times it's dealing with a rookery, or a place where birds accumulate and nest. It takes a fair bit of vision and talent to bring together these resources, and we're very dependent on places like the Natural History Survey and people who do PhD work and occupy stations in life that where they're experts in these things, and we have to fund those people and find out what they're finding out, so they have to become somewhat public, and people have to be in a position where they listen. Our own program on this radio session is an attempt to for WEFT to help the public know about things that we might be interested in. I think that's all I wanted to say about that particular thing. I would at the same time say something about the Kickapoo Trail. Let's move. We've got a few minutes here. Yes, we've got 10 minutes. Okay. The Kickapoo Trail this week is covered with snow. And I wonder if there are any people out there doing cross-country skiing. I'm not sure whether the ice and snow is favorable, but it would seem to me that would be an interesting use of that corridor. We as Heartland Pathways had a lot to do with initiating that trail, but it has become a deal that is complete. We took out a interim trail use agreement with the federal government that preserves railroad beds, and that has brought forth $12 million for 25 miles of trail. And it will take a number of years to put this into action, but we still watch it. It's been now in the hands of the responsible hands of the Champaign County Forest Preserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District. So this is in perpetuity. It's on the way, and that to some extent liberates Heartland Pathways to go back to the Monticello area where we have 33 miles that relate to some of the things we're talking about. We will still keep our eye on the Kickapoo Trail. We're especially interested in the preservation of the prairie on and round and between the main line that's abandoned and the interurban that's nearby, and the highway, Route 150. So we're there, and we have to be at meetings and try to explain to local citizens the value of the recreational value, the biological value, and the cultural value of things like a square elevator in the middle of nowhere, which was once a place where you could bring a horse that wouldn't have to drag grain more than 8 miles. So just there's a written new history there that we encourage, and we're very pleased with public reaction. The public has provided funds above and beyond the $3 million that have been put into the area between Banner and St. Joe. The low bid there was higher than the federal government contributions, so the public has been very generous there. So we think that is okay. So go back to the Heartland Pathways, which is in the Monticello area. It is on the three ends of the Railroad Museum, 7 miles. The Railroad Museum, when ICG closed out, the Railroad Museum was already using the old Interurban, the IT Illinois Traction Company line that ran parallel to the main line. The main line probably came in, I would guess, in 1850s, late 1850s perhaps. It might even have been after the Civil War. I think it was before that. The Interurban was a more recent event that came in when electricity was corralled to the point that it could run small, lightweight interurban trains between various towns. That interurban electricity also provided electricity for the small towns all along the line. So it was rather an important feature. Now, the Railroad Museum has ownership of the interurban as well as the ICG, which closed out in the 80s, late 80s. We being Heartland Pathways, bought 3 sections. One is on the west side that runs toward Allerton Park and Cisco. Then the rail at that end from Cisco to Decatur has become a grain line that is still used. When you go past, the part of that line has already been put into a 2-mile Sangamon Bridge Trail, which goes over the Sangamon River with a bridge on top of a truss bridge, a big long trestle and a bridge. That's positive. Then you encounter the Railroad Museum, which has bought a Y there that allows you to turn a train around, and it has access to Norfolk Southern Railroad coming from north-south down to Bement and then across country on the Wabash line. The Railroad Museum is very popular, and it's become a feature of Monticello advertising and a tourist attraction. It runs trains regularly on 3 miles of its 7-mile railbed. It constantly improves. It has been donated or has bought rolling stock, which is historic. It has big barns to keep those pieces of equipment in a safe and protected manner. It has a steam engine as well as early diesel engines, and it runs regularly. At the other end of this railroad line that the Monticello Railroad Museum owns, it goes up and over the Cerro Gordo moraine, just where this 21 acres that we're talking about is. Then it heads to White Heath. And at White Heath, there is another Y, and the train can move to Champaign, or it can go to Clinton. When the railroad was operating most recently in the 80s, This train would start at Champaign, go to Bonneville, Seymour, Whiteheath, and then it would take one leg of the Y to Shady Rest, Lodge, DeLand, Weldon, Lane, and Clinton. The train could then move down to Decatur and come back through Oriana and through Cisco and back to Monticello and Whiteheath, back to Champaign. That was the local. It could go that way, or it could go the reverse. It could go Champaign, Whiteheath, Monticello, Decatur, Decatur up to Clinton, Clinton back to Lodge, Whiteheath, and into Champaign. That was the history. It's about 100 feet wide, and that represents not only the railroad bed that could be a trail, but it represents the on either side an area that is relatively undisturbed and unchemicalized, so it's of importance to us. That corridor could go down in active fashion to Shady Rest. Shady Rest is behind Whiteheath. It's Whiteheath is on the Saratoga Moraine, so it's high, and the train used to go down to the river, and it could stop there and take on water. So there's the pedestal for a water tower, so the train could stop and load water quickly, and there were pumping devices that pumped water into that vat. The nearby Shady Rest is 30 acres. Part of it is on the Saratoga Moraine, and part of it is on the banks of the Sangamon River. It's a historic site. It was a recreational site in horse era time, so it is not only a natural area with rather wonderful understory herbs, but and forest. It's a historic site with big trees and little trees and no in-between trees, which meant that was a picnic ground in its day. We have to think about taking a train down to Shady Rest, as it probably did in the past. We don't know whether there were chautauquas at that location, but it's possible that historic museum train could go down 1 mile to the banks of the Sangamon and deliver people in their day 5 cents if you were going to the Chautauqua, but it probably now would cost more to do that, and it costs to put in the corridor. In its day, people would walk down the railroad line. Today, that's a fairly dangerous thing to do, so there is access through Monticello Road, which is now called Shady Rest Road, and there is parking facilities, so you can get into Shady Rest without having to walk down the railroad bed. We have to think about the area on the other side of the embankment, which in this case is forested. Is that forested area cud trees, or is it native vegetation? A little bit of both. There is the interesting fact that railroads used to go down and across rivers by going down a tributary. That saved them excavating, either having a high bridge that went across the river at grade, or you would go down across the stream. So we have in that location a bridge that is like a trestle that goes over this creek, and the creek meanders around, but then there's a truss bridge and another trestle, and that corridor could extend to Lodge Park, and it could join the Norfolk Southern line and do things like restauranting on the rails if you had imagination. This is not likely to happen quickly. This is thinking 200 years. But it all relates around, at the moment, one little piece of property of 21 acres that could be a very useful site for young folk, scouts, to be involved with. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.